Went to check on my grandmother on a Tuesday afternoon, and I almost didn't go. That's the part that still gets me. I almost didn't go. I had laundry piled on the couch, a work deadline I kept pushing back, and honestly, I'd been telling myself she was fine. My cousin had hired a caregiver for her back in the spring, and every time I called, he'd answer before Grandma even had a chance to pick up and say, "She's great, she's resting, you know how she is." And I believed him. Because it was easier to believe him. My name is June. I'm 32 years old. I live about 40 minutes from the house where my grandmother, Helen, has lived for the past 37 years. 40 minutes. That's nothing, and somehow I had let 3 months go by without walking through that front door. I don't have a good reason for that. I just want to be honest about it. The thing that finally made me go was a phone call, except it wasn't from my grandmother or my cousin. It was from her neighbor, a quiet older woman named Pat, who lives across the street and has known my grandmother since before I was born. Pat called me on a Monday evening and said she hadn't seen Helen outside in weeks. She said the lights in the house had a strange pattern, on and off at odd hours, and that she'd waved at the caregiver a few times, but the woman barely acknowledged her. Pat said she wasn't trying to cause trouble. She just thought someone in the family should know. I thanked her and hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Then I told myself it was probably nothing. That my grandmother was maybe just tired more than usual. That the caregiver was probably just private. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Pat said it. I just thought someone in the family should know. Like she'd been sitting with it for a while before she picked up the phone. The next morning I got in my car and drove to my grandmother's house without calling ahead. The neighborhood looks the same as it always has. Old oak trees along the sidewalk, houses with wide front porches, kids' bikes left out in driveways. My grandmother's house is a pale yellow 2-story with white trim. She planted rose bushes along the front walk 30 years ago, and she tends them every spring. Except that Tuesday, when I pulled up, the rose bushes were overgrown and dry. A couple of the branches had broken and were just hanging there, bent at wrong angles. Nobody had touched them in a while. I sat in my car for a second looking at them. Then I got out and knocked. The caregiver, a woman in her 40s whose name I'd only heard once, answered the door. She looked surprised to see me, which I thought was a strange reaction. I'm the granddaughter. I told her I was there to visit my grandmother, and she nodded and stepped back to let me in, but something in her face was closed off in a way I couldn't quite name. The house smelled different. I noticed it immediately. My grandmother's house has always smelled like the vanilla candles she keeps on the kitchen windowsill and something faintly floral, lavender maybe, from the sachets she puts in her closets. That Tuesday it smelled stale, like windows that hadn't been opened, like food left too long, like a place where not much was moving. I walked into the living room, and my grandmother was sitting in her armchair by the window. She was awake. She turned when she heard me come in, and her face changed. Went soft and surprised and happy all at once, the way it does when she hasn't expected a visit. But then I actually looked at her. She had lost weight. A lot of weight. Her arms looked thin inside her cardigan sleeves, and her face was hollowed in a way I didn't recognize. She looked smaller than I remembered, and I had only seen her 3 months ago. I stood there smiling at her and trying not to let my expression shift, because I didn't want to scare her, but inside something had dropped in my chest. "Grandma," I said, and crossed the room and hugged her, and she felt fragile in a way she hadn't before. "June," she said, "I didn't know you were coming. I wanted to surprise you," I told her. I stayed for 2 hours that day. We talked, or tried to. She drifted a few times, lost the thread of what she was saying mid-sentence, which happened occasionally before but seemed more frequent now. She told me she hadn't been very hungry lately. She said her stomach had been bothering her. I asked her what she'd eaten that day, and she thought about it for a moment and said she wasn't sure, that the caregiver had brought her something in the morning, but she couldn't remember what. I went into the kitchen after a while, saying I'd make her some tea. I opened the refrigerator and stood looking at it. There was almost nothing inside. A few condiment jars, half a carton of orange juice with a date that had passed, some leftovers in a container I couldn't identify. For a woman who used to keep her kitchen stocked like a grocery store, whose refrigerator was always full of things she'd cooked in advance, this was wrong in a way that felt loud. I made her tea. I sat back down beside her and watched her drink it, and I kept my voice even and asked how things had been going with the caregiver. My grandmother looked down at her cup for a moment. She's all right, she said carefully, in that tone people use when they don't want to complain. Does she cook for you every day? I asked. She brings me things, my grandmother said. Sometimes I'm just not very hungry. I drove home that afternoon with my hands tight on the wheel. I called my cousin from my car. He picked up on the second ring, which was already different from the usual runaround I got when I called to ask about Grandma. He sounded relaxed, easy, asked me how I was doing, said he'd been meaning to call. I told him I'd just been to see her. I said I was worried about how thin she looked. He was quiet for just a second too long before he said, "She's old, June. She doesn't eat like she used to. The doctor said that's normal." I asked, "Which doctor?" He said the one she's been seeing. I asked what that doctor's name was, and he said he'd have to look it up and he'd text me. He never texted me. I didn't sleep again that night. I went back the next day, this time with groceries. When I arrived, the caregiver looked even less comfortable to see me than the day before. I went through the house while I was putting things away, just naturally moving through rooms, and I noticed small things. My grandmother's jewelry box on her dresser, open. A few pieces she'd had for decades, her pearl earrings, the gold bracelet my grandfather gave her for their anniversary, gone. I asked my grandmother about the bracelet casually, said I'd always loved it, and she looked confused for a moment and said she thought it was in the box. I told my husband that night. His name is Cal. He's quieter than me, methodical in a way I'm not. And he listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he sat thinking for a minute, and then he said, "Something's not right." "I know," I said. He said he wanted to come with me next time. We went together on a Friday. Cal walked through the house with me while the caregiver sat in the kitchen, and I noticed him paying attention to things in a way I wouldn't have thought to. He looked at the thermostat, the calendar on the wall, the pill organizer on the bathroom counter. He opened it quietly and looked at the compartments. Some of the days were empty that shouldn't have been. On the way home, he was quiet for most of the drive. Then he said, "Your grandmother isn't being taken care of properly. This is more than just a bad caregiver. I think someone needs to talk to an elder care advocate or a lawyer." I asked him what he meant, and he said he wanted to look into something first before he said more. That night, Cal sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and I watched him search things I didn't think to search. He pulled up public records. He looked at recent changes to financial accounts, the kind of paper trail that exists if you know where to look. He'd done some financial compliance work years ago and knew how to read the signs. An hour into it, he sat back and said my name quietly. I came to stand behind him and looked at the screen. He walked me through it slowly. My grandmother had a trust, set up years ago, with my cousin listed as primary beneficiary, and a provision that the trust would transfer fully to him upon her death, or in the event she was deemed legally incapacitated. There was nothing unusual about that on its own, but Cal had found something else. A financial power of attorney had been updated 8 months ago. Recent withdrawals from my grandmother's accounts, several of them, some to a household expense account, but others that didn't have a clear designation. And the caregiver, whose name I finally looked up, had a connection to my cousin that went back years. She wasn't some stranger he'd hired through an agency. She was the sister of someone he'd gone to college with, someone he was still in regular contact with. I felt the floor shift under me. "He hired her," I said. Cal nodded slowly. "And I don't think she's there to take care of your grandmother." I sat down. I kept trying to put the pieces somewhere that made sense, some version of this where I was wrong, where there was a reasonable explanation, because this was my cousin. I'd grown up with him at holiday tables and 4th of July cookouts and family reunions in the backyard of this same house where my grandmother had lived for 37 years. He'd stood next to me at my grandfather's funeral. I'd sent him a card when he lost his job 2 years ago. But the more I sat with it, the more the shape of it became undeniable. He wasn't trying to steal from her in some dramatic way. He was being patient. The caregiver wasn't starving my grandmother in one terrible moment. She was letting her decline, reducing her food slowly, not making sure she took her medication, keeping her isolated, not letting her outside, not letting her talk to neighbors like Pat, not encouraging her to call family, letting her grow weak and confused and dependent. Because a woman who is frail enough, confused enough, documented as declining rapidly, that woman can be moved toward an incapacity determination. And once that happens, the trust transfers. He wouldn't have to wait for her to die naturally. He could accelerate the process legally, quietly, with paperwork. I started crying somewhere in the middle of Cal explaining this to me, and I didn't even fully realize it until he reached over and put his hand on mine. "What do we do?" I asked. He said, "We start documenting everything. Tonight." The next morning I called an elder law attorney whose name I found through a recommendation from my own doctor's office. I explained the situation and she told me we needed to act quickly. She outlined the steps: an independent medical evaluation of my grandmother, a formal investigation into the power of attorney amendment, and a report to Adult Protective Services. She also said that if there was any documentation of the financial activity, that would be critical. That same day, Cal and I went back to the house. We told the caregiver there would be a medical appointment, and she needed to step out for a few hours. She pushed back, said she needed to check with the family, meaning my cousin, and I told her clearly that I was family and she did not work for my cousin, she worked for my grandmother. And if she had a problem with that, she was welcome to bring it up with the attorney whose card I was about to put on the kitchen counter. She left. While she was gone, Cal checked the house more carefully. My grandmother has a small smart display in her bedroom, one of those devices with a screen that my aunt had set up years ago so my grandmother could video call family more easily. Cal looked at it and then looked at me and said, "This thing logs activity." He spent 20 minutes going through it, and what he found made something cold settle into my chest. There were outgoing calls logged, but very few incoming ones over the past several weeks. And there were voice queries my grandmother had made, talking to the device the way she'd been taught to talk to it, asking it things when she was alone. She'd asked it what day it was. She'd asked it whether her medication was supposed to make her feel dizzy. She'd asked it once, at 11:30 at night, whether it was normal to feel confused all the time. That one I couldn't read out loud when Cal showed it to me. I just stood there. We had the independent medical evaluation done within the week. The doctor who examined my grandmother was thorough and direct. She said my grandmother was significantly malnourished. Her medication levels were inconsistent, meaning she had not been receiving them reliably. The doctor said that some of what appeared to be cognitive decline was likely exacerbated by dehydration and inadequate nutrition, and that with proper care, some of it might be reversible. She documented everything. She filed a formal report. Adult Protective Services opened an investigation the same week. I called my cousin before the investigators reached him. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I needed to hear what he would say. He answered and I told him. I knew what was happening. I knew about the caregiver. I knew about the power of attorney. I knew about the withdrawals. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said I was overreacting, that he was trying to manage a complicated situation, that I hadn't been there for months and didn't understand what had been going on, that Grandma's decline was natural and he was doing his best. I said, "She asked the device at 11:30 at night if it was normal to feel confused all the time. That is not you doing your best." He didn't say anything after that. He was interviewed by investigators the following week. The caregiver was let go immediately, and a new, properly vetted agency was brought in. The financial records were reviewed by the court. The power of attorney amendment was found to have been executed under circumstances that raised serious questions about undue influence, and it was challenged successfully. My grandmother's assets were frozen pending review, and a court-appointed guardian ad litem was assigned to represent her interests independently. It took about 4 months for the full legal process to move through. My cousin retained an attorney and tried to fight several of the claims, but the documentation was clear. The medical records, the financial records, the device logs, the testimony from Pat across the street who had been watching and worrying for months before she finally called me. The court found that my cousin had exercised undue influence over my grandmother's financial affairs and had facilitated neglect through the caregiver arrangement. He was ordered to repay the withdrawn funds in full. He was removed as beneficiary of the trust, and he was criminally charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony in our state. He pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for full repayment and 3 years of supervised probation. I sat in the courtroom that day, and I watched him stand before the judge, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I might feel relief, or anger, or something clean and final. Instead, I just felt tired and sad, in the way you feel sad when something you can't undo has already happened. My grandmother came to live with Cal and me for 2 months while we helped her stabilize. She gained back most of the weight she had lost. She started taking her medications correctly. Her confusion improved substantially, which the doctor had said might happen with proper nutrition and care. She started going outside again in the mornings, and one Saturday she came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and said she wanted to do something about her rose bushes before it got too late in the season. I drove her to the garden center, and she spent an hour walking the rows of plants with more energy than I'd seen in a long time. She picked out pruning shears and some fertilizer and a new pair of gloves. On the way home, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to say it." I looked over at her. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. She thought about it. "He always answered first," she said simply. I had to grip the steering wheel a little harder after that, because that was the whole thing, right there in one sentence. He always answered first. And I had called just enough times to feel like I was checking in without ever actually checking in. She's back in her own house now. We hired a new caregiver through a reputable agency, someone who has been wonderful, and I stop by twice a week without exception. I set up a direct video call link that goes straight to my phone so my grandmother can reach me without going through anyone else. I gave Pat my number and told her to use it any time, for any reason. The rose bushes are doing better. She pruned them herself on a Sunday morning in October while I sat on the porch steps with my coffee and watched. She was wearing her new gloves and she worked slowly but steadily, cutting away what had died so the rest of it could grow. I don't tell this story to make myself look good. I wasn't there for 3 months. That's real, and I have to live with it. I tell it because I think about how many families have a cousin who always answers the phone first, and a grandmother who has stopped being hungry, and a neighbor across the street who noticed something and wasn't sure she had the right to say anything. The machinery of something like this is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just slowly makes a person smaller, and if nobody comes to look, eventually smaller is all that's left. Listen to the neighbor who calls you. Drive over without warning. Hug the person you've been meaning to visit for 3 months. Because I almost didn't go on that Tuesday afternoon, and I cannot let myself forget what almost means. I still think about the rose bushes sometimes, how they were just hanging there, broken and dry, and I almost drove past them without really seeing them. That's the thing about slow harm. It doesn't look like harm at first. It looks like busyness, like an old woman who isn't very hungry lately. It hides inside ordinary explanations, and if you're not paying close enough attention, you'll accept every single one of them. My cousin didn't wake up one morning and decide to be a monster. That's not how it works. It started with a small decision, then another, each one easier than the last because nobody was pushing back. He answered the phone before my grandmother could. He hired someone he trusted not to ask questions. He counted on the fact that families like ours stay busy, stay distant, send cards at Christmas and tell ourselves that's enough. He was right about all of it, until he wasn't. And here is what I've come to understand about how that kind of thing eventually falls apart. It falls apart because of people who refuse to look away. Pat, who stood at her window week after week and felt something was wrong and finally picked up the phone even though she wasn't sure it was her place. Cal, who sat at our kitchen table at midnight and followed a paper trail that I wouldn't have known how to read, who used what he knew to protect someone he loved. My grandmother herself, who asked a device in the dark whether it was normal to feel confused all the time, who held on even when she didn't fully understand what she was holding on from. Every one of them did something that required a kind of quiet courage that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. I think about what it took from Cal to sit with those records and say out loud what they meant. It would have been easier to second-guess himself, to say maybe there's an innocent explanation, to avoid the conversation entirely. But he didn't do that. He followed the truth wherever it went, even when the truth was uncomfortable, and he did it carefully and methodically because the situation required that. Intelligence without integrity is just cleverness used in the wrong direction. What Cal had was both, pointed at something that mattered, and I think about what it took for me to keep going back, to file the reports, to sit across from an attorney and explain what I suspected about my own family, to stand in that house and tell the caregiver to leave. None of it felt brave in the moment. It felt exhausting and sad and uncertain. But I've learned that that's often exactly what doing the right thing feels like. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like choosing over and over not to stop. My grandmother is tending her rose bushes again. That's the ending I get to have, and I don't take it for granted for a single day. I almost didn't go on that Tuesday. I almost let the laundry and the deadline and my cousin's easy reassurances be enough. The version of this story where I don't go is a version I cannot let myself think about for too long. So if there is something useful in any of this, it's just that. Go. Check in person. Listen to the neighbor who hesitated before calling you. Trust the feeling that something isn't adding up. The people who love us are sometimes being made smaller very quietly, and they need someone who will notice before smaller is all that's left.